As you know, I had the wonderful opportunity at the last conference to interview many of you about a range of subjects. One of the main themes, many related obviously, being the extension of human life, issues of mortality. Some of you spoke about the concern about death, or conversely, the desire for immortality. Sherm's wonderful talk concluding that CR is not enough. We need to do something quick. That by his estimating 105 years is not enough, of course, speaks to the underlying fear. Richard's test results indicate a higher level of anxiety or neurosis, perhaps a concern about life and death that exists among us, and that's what I'll speak about. It's quite a bit off topic. No biological science here. I'm not going to do PowerPoint. I'm actually going to bring up a slide that was in Dean's wonderful talk a little later. There are no numbers, which is a two-edged sword. No one can question my numbers, but then there are no numbers to quantify my conclusions. Although what I will discuss does have a clinical basic from a psychological point of view. Much of this is based on the work of Ernest Becker, who was a cultural anthropologist at the University of Berkeley in the 1960s and 70s, and he produced a book called The Denial of Death. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a personal standpoint regarding books that have had a major influence in my life, both in altering my entire perspective of living or my lifestyle, and then perhaps you'll see where I'm coming from the perspective of this talk. Becker's point of view with references to Freud, Jung, and Maslow. What does all of this have to do with CR? Well, the 6 books that have really influenced me, 2 of them are fiction, and the other 4 are nonfiction. The first being A Death in the Family by James Agee. It was a 1956 Pulitzer Prize novel of a family dealing with the early accidental death of a father and the resulting traumatic effect on the family. Of Mice and Men was John Steinbeck's wonderful short novelette of the theme being of how to live with an unfathomable life or death dilemma. Many of you have read it, I'm sure. From nonfiction, of course, top of my list is The 120-Year Diet by Roy Walford, who also introduced me to his first chapter, as many people have referenced, to empirical science and the nature of evidence. Beyond Humanity, Cyber Revolution and Human Future was given to me by David Stern at the last conference. And this is a very, very interesting concept I'll talk about later. And The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. Like I mentioned, he was a professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Berkeley, California. Most of his studies concerned universal cultural and psychological issues and a re-examination of psychoanalysis and, in a way, a deconstruction of Freud. Most of Becker's theories were based on the work of Otto Rank, who was a contemporary of Freud, and Norman O. Brown's work, Life Against Death. Although Becker's book encompasses just about life and the universe and everything else. It's a very, very interesting read. And then the last one is A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. It's an interesting book because well, all of the books above either have death in the title or dealing with death in some way, and that includes Roy's book. And I've read each of them countless times, except for Stephen Hawking's book, which I've read only once, which is hard enough to get through. But his book is interesting because it discusses the nature of the universe, how it began, and how it will end. And I'll get to the implications of this from a psychological standpoint later on. So let me talk first, insert a caveat about the data supporting the series and the perspectives I will review. When I began reviewing Becker a month ago, re-reviewing him, the book I've read at least 15 or 20 times over the last 15 years, there are multiple references and citations in his work, and some of his conclusions from the analysts are based on clinical observations, some empirical, some not, and of course there's much referenced research, quotes from philosophers such as Kierkegaard that are inserted here and there. In all, he cites authors whose references to me seem to ring true. You'll have to tell me after the talk. Clinical observations made by many of the analysts cited is not as rigorous as more formal testing and may be called, Roy might appreciate this, anecdotal evidence in large numbers. But then I discovered that much of Becker's work is being validated now through more recent research and studies. In fact, last week I discovered a website devoted to studies validating his theories, and I tend to spend more time researching that. So I ask you to keep your minds open and see if what I relate seems to ring true, and in subsequent discussion perhaps I'll review more of the current research supporting Becker's theories. Otherwise, some of what I'm going to relate may seem speculative in nature. All right, I'm going to begin with a quote, Dr. Johnson's famous quote that the prospect of death wonderfully concentrates the mind. The main thesis of Becker's view is that it does much more than that. The idea of death, the fear of it, what he calls the terror of death, haunts the human animal like nothing else. It is the mainspring of human activity. Activity designed largely to avoid the fatality of death, to overcome it by denying in some way that it is the final destiny of man. There is a view that primitive cultures were not bothered by the fear of death. They celebrated it. Evidence that cultural anthropologists bring up, but Becker argues that, of course, primitives often celebrate death, as the Irish do in the Irish Wake. I'm Irish. I've been to a couple of those. And they did because they believe that death is the ultimate promotion to the enjoyment of eternity in some form. Most modern Westerners have trouble believing this anymore, and what the forsaking of religion for so many makes the fear of death so prominent a part of their psychological makeup. CR represents, in my view, a scientific solution or a partial solution to the prospect of death, and I'll go into that later on. Becker shows that the fear of death is a universal issue that unites data from several disciplines of the human sciences, and in fact his background as a cultural anthropologist provided him a unique, broad perspective to speak on this. The motivations of those of us on CR, in my opinion, have deep personal motivations, as has been discussed earlier, and I hope to connect it to Becker's work. As I mentioned, one of the main goals of his was a summing up of psychology after Freud by bringing really the whole development of psychology back to Kierkegaard, who is who in a sense was the author of psychoanalysis, although he didn't know it. And here's where what I may say may sound a bit fringe, but Becker argues for a merger of psychology and mythical religious perspectives. But my hope is that this group can appreciate a fringe idea, which we certainly have in our practice, even if it is in a different discipline. Philosopher William James said lyrically that the fear of death was the worm at the core of man's pretensions of happiness. In a paper written by the psychoanalyst Gregory Zilborg, he said that most people think death fear is absent because it rarely shows its true face. But he argues that underneath all appearances, fear of death is universally present. He sums it up as follows. For behind the sense of insecurity in the face of danger, behind the sense of discouragement and depression, there always lurks the basic fear of death. You're going to hear that word death a lot of times in this, by the way. A fear which undergoes most complex elaborations and manifests itself in man in very many indirect ways. No one is free of the fear of death. The anxiety neurosis, the various phobic states, even a considerable number of depressive, suicidal states, and many schizophrenias amply demonstrate the ever-present fear of death, which becomes woven into the major conflicts of the given psychopathological condition. This is a very broad statement. Zilberg was a clinical psychologist. He saw hundreds of patients. I know there's a genetic evidence and a basis for a lot of clinical depression and schizophrenia and so on. I'll give an anecdotal evidence since I'm free from any numbers at this point. A friend of mine is slightly schizophrenic and manic depressive, and I decided to call him up and say, "Do you ever think about death?" You know, as I was writing this, and he said, "Every day." So I'll get to the meaning of that and how it deals with people who are overwhelmed with this, and how character defenses make it difficult for certain mental illnesses to sort of hold up to this, to the onslaught of our reality. From an evolutionary and physiological perspective, Zilberg's point is that such constant expenditure of psychological energy on the business of preserving life would be impossible if the fear of death were not a constant. The very term self-preservation implies an effort against some force of disintegration. The effective affect of this is fear. In Becker's words, the fear of death must be present behind all our normal functionings in some way in order for the organism to be armed towards self-preservation. This sounds like perhaps an obvious statement relating to CR, in fact, in lieu of what we've seen today. Self-preservation in the face of the great black void. But here's the big hitch behind an organism's awareness of its mortality, as we as humans have. And that is that the fear of death cannot be present constantly in one's mental functioning, else the organism could not function. Why? Well, to live in a constant state of terror would provoke a continual state of the fight or flight syndrome, and would be intolerable. So again, this fear of death is always there, influencing much of our behavior, angst, and anxiety.